Hello, this is Andrés Martinez with the New America Foundation. I am here with Ana Francisca Vega from Animal Político, and this is Worldwise for Blogging Heads. Hello, Ana Francisca.
Hi, Andrés. Very nice to be here with you.
So, you are the deputy editor of Animal Político, and you are in Mexico City. You want to tell us a little bit about Animal Político?
Sure. Animal Político is a general news website. We've been on air for about a year and a half. We sort of specialize in issues such as transparency, corruption. We're very interested in those things, human rights. So that's pretty much our agenda. And we have a very strong emphasis as well on digital journalism and the use of social networks to communicate, in a rather different way with the audience. And it might sound not very innovative for U.S. standards, but for Mexican standards, it's quite a novelty. So we've been quite successful in doing that, in trying to incentive different kinds of communication and different kinds of conversations especially with young people. Our audience is very young. It's like most of our audience is less than 35 years old, and that's something that we're very proud of.
Well, I have to say, I think even by U.S. standards, it's a very innovative publication. I'm a fan. It reads like a cross between Slate and Politico, and I know that Animal Político has been very much at the forefront of creating a new form of media and having, it's been instrumental in organizing students around politics, as well as having a lot of established columnists and just great news features. So congratulations on that. And also I should mention you host a TV show in Mexico on technology every day.
I do.
So you're go ahead.
No, well, it's a daily show. I'm very interested in innovation and technology. So also on participation, of digital platforms, citizenship news. So yes, that's a daily show.
So you're incredibly busy, and so we're grateful to have you on this week of the Mexican election. And I think we should start off. I should break the news to you, Ana Francisca, that the Mexican election has not been the all-consuming news in the U.S. this week. I know this will come as a shock to you, but we've had a lot of competing news stories, like the annual hot dog eating contest occurs on the eve of July 4th, and so Mexico has not been barely, shall we say, front-page news. There's probably been a lot more analysis and discussion about the elections in Egypt and our own primary season. So I think for those of us, or for those people here in the States who don't follow Mexican politics that closely, we should start off just by kind of setting the scene. And if you could step back and talk a little bit about what was at stake in this election, who were the main candidates, and what the outcome was. We can do that very briefly and then kind of get into the analysis.
Sure. Just one thing first. I'm not very surprised that it was not news in the U.S. The hot dog contest is a lot more important in some ways. But the U.S. media and the U.S. public has never been that interested in politics in Mexico. And I think that's a subject that should be analyzed, maybe in another conversation, because it's really shocking since the stakes are so high for both countries. But talking about the Mexican election, what was at stake here was the return of the PRI, which is the party that ruled the country for 71 years. And for the first time in 12 years, there was a big chance that the PRI could make its comeback, and all the polls show that. We have to say that 60% of Mexicans right now, even before the elections, were already governed by PRI politicians, at state level.
Right.
That's something that one should note. But winning the presidential race is quite different. So the PRI had a very appealing candidate for some. He's very handsome, he's young, he's married to a television actress.
Right.
So for many people, he's very attractive. The leftist candidate is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is the one that he ran also for presidency last time. He's the main leftist leader in Mexico.
Right.
And the governing party, the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party candidate was the first woman that was, that had chances to make it to the executive office, which was Josefina Vázquez Mota. So that was, the setting, and the winner was Enrique Peña Nieto, as far as we know.
Right. Right. So the PRI is an interesting beast by any measure. It's the starting by the name, which is sort of an oxymoron. It's the Party of the Institutionalized Revolution. What's that? Which is telling, and it governed the country for 70 years, as you mentioned. And I think there was one moment when Mexico really kind of broke into the consciousness of Americans who follow international news more so than usual in 2000, when the PRI finally loses a presidential election to the conservative National Action Party candidate Vicente Fox, who for about 15 minutes was kind of a rock star globally, and he was the former head of Coca-Cola in Mexico and a kind of charismatic guy, and he and Bush hit it off famously for, and there was talk of immigration reform, etc. But that moment in 2000, it felt like the Mexican equivalent of the Berlin Wall was coming down, and lo and behold, after 2 6-year terms of this opposition party, the PRI wins again. Somebody that you and I both know, Denise Stresser, a political scientist in Mexico, compares the yearning for the return of the PRI, to the Putin phenomenon in Russia. This idea that there's some nostalgia for a time when the government, people in government knew how to run things, and you might not always appreciate the ways they went about things, but things got done. And all of this opening and democratization has been a little too chaotic. Do you think there's something to that thesis, or what else was driving the PRI back into office?
Yes, I think the PAN, Fox's Vicente Fox's party and current President Calderon's party had a very good chance to make things right in a way and try to consolidate the democratic transition in Mexico, and they just didn't. Right. A couple of things that could have been approved that we were moving in the right direction would have been the political reform, which didn't happen or happened partially, and the other thing, for example, is tackling the huge conflicting issue of the education in Mexico, the syndicate, the teachers union, which is a very corrupt structure, and it's probably one of the most important. The head of the union is one of the most important figures that reflect corruption, and tackling those issues would have been a good start point, but they didn't, and they didn't try to establish fluid conversations with the opposition. They didn't try to make a common legislative agenda with the other parties. So they just lost a huge chance of convincing the Mexican people.
And then I should interject Fox's successor, Felipe Calderón, who assumed office in 2006, because under the Mexican Constitution there's no chance of a re-election. So even the PRI, when it ruled for 70 years, one of the reasons why it seemed like such a well-oiled machine was it really was the party, not any one individual, because there's no re-election. But anyways, Calderón comes in 2006, and the other thing that obviously happened in the bond period was he declares an all-out war against the drug cartels and mobilizes the army into the streets, and the results have been very mixed at best. I mean, that's a generous way to put it.
Yeah.
And did that
Yes.
play? How large do you think the drug war, which again is, if Americans focus on Mexico at all, that might be the one thing they're focused on. How large did that loom in the calculus of voters going to the polls last Sunday?
A lot, I think. I mean, one thing is efficiency, which you mentioned before. There's this weird perception that the PRI or that Enrique Peña Nieto is a particular efficient guy. The record doesn't show that precisely, but that's the perception. And the other thing, as you mentioned, it is organized. I mean, the war on drugs and the 60,000 people dead in Mexico in Felipe Calderón's administration.
You said 60,000?
That weighted, yes.
Okay.
I mean, probably more. But that's
numbers, yeah.
That's the official number. So people are very tired of feeling insecure in the streets, and they blame Felipe Calderón for that. What is a paradox is that Felipe Calderón has, I mean, of course he has a responsibility because he's promoting this war from the federal front, but the governors are, very important actors in this war, and they are not taking any responsibility. So, it's like they don't even exist for citizens, and they should be taking this responsibility because security is also, part of what they are supposed to provide to the people that they govern.
Right.
So Felipe Calderón, the federal level is taking all the blame, at least in terms of public opinion, and in a paradox, even some of the most violent states are actually governed by PRI politicians.
So the PRI roughly governs, I think it's 2/3 of the states.
Yes.
These days. And
it's 60% of Mexicans are governed by PRI.
Right. Yeah, I mean the number of states would probably be higher than the population because Mexico City is not governed by the PRI. But yeah, I mean I think that's worth noting that even though 2000 felt like this historic watershed moment where the PRI was voted out of the presidency, they did retain the governorship of a lot of states. They retained a very important faction in the Congress. And so I think one of the arguments for the greater efficiency of the Peña Nieto administration is that you're back in the sort of having the vertically integrated model of governors having to respond to the president of the same party. I kind of have a theory that, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or that the next few years are going to be quite good for Mexico, partly because the PRI and this young, charismatic president, as you described him, Enrique Peña Nieto, are going to be able to do a lot of the things that they've been blocking for years. A lot of the reforms that need to be done, whether it's taking on this national teachers union that you described being a roadblock to progress, which clearly it is, or whether it's liberalizing the energy sector and allowing for private investment into the Pemex, the state monopoly, or whether it's some of the political reforms that need to occur. He now, Peña Nieto, that is, in a kind of, Nixon goes to China analogy, which people are making, can get a lot of this through the Congress. And it's going to be very, cynical at some level because they've been the problem for years, blocking a lot of the stuff, and now they can see the solution and reap the dividends. Is that? And I don't know how to feel about that. I'm both Mexican and American. I grew up in Mexico, and I wish Mexico the best. And but the fact that the PRI is going to get the credit for this, it leaves me feeling kind of ambivalent. But do you think that's...
I totally agree with you. I think that the next few years we have to say first that, part of part of what we're going to see in the next few years is going to be defined in the next few months. That's one thing, which is the way that we resolve, the electoral conflicts that are, arising right now. I mean, it's not as bad as 2006, but we don't know what's going to happen. That's for sure, because the election it's a contested election, and there are certain things that have to be sorted out before we can say. I mean, we can actually say Enrique Peña Nieto is going to be the next president and he's going to govern in this in this environment. But I agree with you. I think, for example, in terms of economy, what Felipe Calderón has been doing, which has been doing quite good. I mean, the economy is quite stable. We're growing. Our growth is not as mediocre as one would think if you see the numbers of the growth numbers around the world. So he's been doing things quite all right in terms of the economy. But this is going to pay off in the next few years. So Enrique Peña Nieto is going to have, a pretty good base, an economic base to, to say, this is what I've been doing. This is good. This is my job. But actually, it's not his. In terms of security, I think, of course, the levels of violence are going to decrease, and that's for sure. Because the strategy is going to change a bit.
I sort of agree with you, but talk a little bit about that. Why do you assert so decisively that the levels of violence will decrease?
Well, he said he was gonna make some important changes in the security section. He's gonna double the number of policemen. So that's gonna, in terms of public security, is gonna be quite a change. And I think he's gonna be more selective in terms of what he chooses to fight. It's, if you read the analysis about what Felipe Calderón has been doing, he's been like, he's reactive. He's very reactive. There's no clear strategy. So I think Enrique Peña Nieto is going to play his cards a little bit more, smarter in a sense, and that's going to decrease levels of violence in certain parts of Mexico, which are actually a disaster right now.
Right. I think my impression is that President Calderón has been, he's very absolutist on this stuff, and he in a very sincere way would like to end the drug trade. Period. My sense is that most Mexicans are at a point where they don't think that it's worth trying to achieve that goal necessarily. That if the Americans want to consume drugs, and why should Mexicans be killing each other to prevent that? And I think everybody's fed up with the levels of violence that has been that's been triggered not just by the government going after the cartels, but also by the cartels vying for market share from each other in spectacular, heinous ways. But I'm not sure that intramural level of violence between the cartels is sustainable much longer, anyways. And I think that if the message goes out that we are going to go after cartels that create mayhem that is destabilizing to society, but maybe not necessarily prioritize, ending the trade per se, because we have other priorities. Things might, calm down, as you suggest, and I think most Mexicans would kind of take that deal. I mean, there was a drug trade in the 80s and 90s that and going back to the 70s, that for the most part, people just kind of looked the other way, and it was just the roots of stuff going up to the United States. Am I being too...
I'm not sure. I mean, I think we can see the pulse. There's an important section of Mexican people saying, I agree with what Felipe Calderón is doing, and I just don't agree on the way that he's doing things. I think it was, in a sense, it was an unsustainable situation in terms of, probably not in big urban areas in which you sort of don't see drug cartels going around in very huge pickups, but in very good part of Mexico that was not the case. The narco had already taken over entire villages, and that was something that was not acceptable for many people. What I think is that what Felipe Calderón did really, really, really bad, apart from not planning precisely his next move and being very reactive, what he did very bad was in terms of the victims, because the 60,000 people that have been killed in the last few years. I mean, of course, some of them are related to drug crimes, but we don't really know how many people were just innocent, pass-byers and were shot, and that's one of the things that Mexican people have been very aware of and increasingly aware of, and that's one of the main things that Mexican people are saying, hey, we don't agree with this. We don't accept, kids being killed on the streets, and mothers and fathers and grandpas and grandmas, because we've heard all these stories. There's very important victim organizations that have been very vocal about what's been going on, and I think that's probably one of the things that Mexicans are not willing to put up with anymore. And the other thing, you were very, very right about it, is that there's an increasing sense that it's very unfair what we've been through in terms of what Mexico has been doing vis-a-vis what the U.S. is doing in terms of fighting drugs. So that's very unfair. But you know better than anyone that it's just not an issue for the U.S. right now or for the public.
Do you think a majority of Mexicans would want the U.S. to do more in Mexico in terms of helping to fight the cartels, or not?
I think yes. I mean, there's a very different perception on this issue. On the one hand, the Mexican public opinion is in favor of more U.S. intervention in Mexico in terms of helping fight the cartels and stuff.
Which is we should say that's a huge deal given the history and sensitivities about sovereignty, and so it speaks to the moment, right?
Yeah, and it's increasing. I mean, the numbers have been systematically increasing in the past few years. But the thing is that the political class is less keen on doing that, and that's a bit of a paradox.
Right. The one thing that I want to come back to that you mentioned, because I think this is not something that Americans are sufficiently appreciative of, is how relatively well Mexico's economy has been performing, and how important that is to the U.S. economy. Historically, when you look back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, you had global financial crises that started in speculative developing markets. In the mid 90s, it was famously when Mexico kind of went bust, then Robert Rubin and Bill Clinton had to come to the rescue. It was famously referred to as the tequila effect, the domino effect that this had on the global economy. And you had other debt crises coming out of Mexico and countries like Argentina and Turkey that every so often would require the quote unquote responsible economies of Europe and the U.S. and Japan to sort of come to the rescue. And you had people like Alan Greenspan and Bob Rubin would then lecture to Latin Americans about how they needed to get their houses in order and act responsibly. And it was kind of like parents talking to teenagers, it felt like, you know, and the lessons were all about, you know, became known as the Washington Consensus. You know, you got to build up your foreign reserves, live within your means, you know, open up your economies to trade. And the great irony, I think, of the last 10, 15 years is that most of the major developing markets around the world, certainly Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, absorb those lessons and actually put them into effect. And the people doing the preaching, you know, Wall Street and Washington and other developed economies did not. And so when you had this latest, you know, global financial implosion, it was a problem that went from north to south as opposed to, you know, the more classic pattern of south to north. And in fact, one of the things that was most impressive was how resilient Latin American economies and other developing countries in the world were for this tsunami that came from the north. I mean, in terms of having, you know, very responsible fiscal policies that, you know, the United States does not, and having, you know, having handled their currencies in a responsible way. I mean, still, of course, when the U.S. enters into recession, it hurts Mexico terribly, and it did in 2008, 2009. But it wasn't like in previous cases, and Mexico's rebounded quite nicely. And, you know, the way that Mexico's handled its economic policy is something that the U.S. could stand to learn a great deal from. And then again, this is with the limited focus on Mexico being around drug trade and immigration. This is not something that's sufficiently appreciated. But as a result of the new stability that you've seen starting in the last years in the late 90s and up through the present date, you really have had an expansion of the middle class in Mexico with the with credit being more available. You just in the past couldn't really have consumer credit if you had inflation rates of 100% and these, you know, jarring devaluations. But so you've had stability, you've had an expansion of the middle class. A lot of the global trends now are cutting in Mexico's favor in terms of China losing some of its competitive edge on pricing, so that the automotive industry in Mexico is going gangbusters. The economy is supposed to grow like 4% this year. You know, and it remains the second, third, depending on the statistics, largest trading partner of the United States. It's a huge source of profits for American multinational companies. You know, even when there was a front page story recently on the corruption scandal of Walmart in Mexico, which, you know, in some ways was not good publicity for Mexico, obviously. But a lot of friends of mine were staggered to learn in that story that there were 2,100 Walmart stores in Mexico, which is a much greater rate than per capita than in the U.S., where there are, you know, roughly 4,000, but the population is more than twice that of Mexico. So it's just worth pointing out. And one of my frustrations in when I look at how little we pay attention to Mexico is the sort of the inability to think strategically about fulfilling the promise of NAFTA. NAFTA, you know, did a great job of expanding trade, but we haven't really engaged Mexico strategically on things like energy, where Mexico was the second largest supplier of oil last year to the U.S., but the output is plummeting, and you know, maybe Peña Nieto can do something about that. But yes, I wanted to. I've been sort of haranguing here because this is one of my pet peeves: the lack of appreciation for the Mexican economy and its vital role to the U.S. But what are, you know, when you come to the States, and I know you've spent time here and in England, what frustrates you about the way that we look at Mexico or don't look at Mexico?
Well, I think it's you know, for a large part of the U.S. Public opinion, Mexico is just, you know, full of stereotypes. There's no interest in going beyond, you know, what Hollywood shows on the films about Mexico, or there is no interest in going beyond, you know, Cancun and you know spots and places where you know, Americans go on vacation, which is very good. I mean, of course we love Americans coming to Mexico on vacations. That's perfect. but that's not all. I think it's very frustrating because there's so many, there's so much potential in this relationship that is, for me, just very, very frustrating that there's no, and I can say the same thing about Mexico, and Mexicans. We're full of, negative stereotypes when we talk about the U.S. and when we talk about Americans. But I'm pretty sure that we could move forward in a much faster way if we would just take a few moments and think about, the almost million Americans that are living in Mexico and, the Mexicans living in the U.S., about the level of our commercial exchange, about the level of our interconnectedness in terms of, telecommunications, in terms of environment. There's so many areas in which we could move forward, but I think in deep down, what we're lacking is a basic sense of solidarity. There's just not a common gut feeling about wanting to be part of the same region. I think that's pretty much it.
We need a North American solidarity holiday. Maybe that should be July 5th.
Yeah.
Where Canadians, Mexicans, and Americans could all come together.
Yeah, I think Enrique Peña Nieto, in that sense, because you mentioned it, I think he has a much more, established sense of North America, and I think that's good. I think Felipe Calderón and I think Vicente Fox had a very reactive visions about the U.S. They were the classic Mexicans that had very huge reservations when they talked about the U.S. And when they talked with U.S. politicians. And I think Enrique Peña Nieto comes from another tradition, which might actually be, better for the U.S. and Mexican relations. But that's good. And he even said that he was, he will be trying to relaunch NAFTA in a sense. But obviously that's not his decision to make,
Right.
But it's a good step.
And does Animal Político cover immigration debates in the U.S. and things like the Arizona law?
Yes, not as much as we would like to, but yes, we do. I think it's hugely important for us to explain to the Mexican public opinion how the U.S. Legislative process works, because it's quite technical, quite difficult. So, and if you don't explain that correctly, you end up with stereotypes about these guys don't want us and sort of like things like that, which are not very useful. So yes, we do, and I think it's.
So is it fair to say that things like the debate in Arizona create a lot of outrage in Mexico, or concern, or
huge outrage?
Yeah.
Huge outrage. You don't see many. It's very difficult for you to see, such issues come to the front page in the newspapers. And the Arizona law, for example, was in the newspapers in the front page for a long time.
Interesting.
As well as the different attempts that have been going on to, pass a comprehensive immigration reform in the U.S. in the past few years. That's also been in the newspapers as well. And it's increasingly, important for Mexicans because they have family there.
Right. And that's another trend that we should say is changing. The recent data shows that the flow of immigrants has plateaued, and if anything, it's being reversed. And there's, if economists believe it's because of the recession, and there's a demographic shift in Mexico. The population has aged, and or you could also attribute some of it to tougher enforcement on the border. But let me ask you, in the minutes that remain, a couple quicker questions. One is, You mentioned the electoral conflict. I mean, the fact that once again Andrés Manuel López Obrador is contesting the results. He lost. He was the former mayor of Mexico City, because we've been talking mostly about the PAN, the conservative party that won in 2000 and that has ruled the last 12 years. And then you've had the PRI. The third party, because this is sort of a three-way race that we haven't been talking much about, is the PRD, the leftist party, which counts Mexico City as a stronghold. And Andrés Manuel López Obrador came, within a slight margin in 2006, and for 3 years after, he went around the country saying he was a legitimate president and he had been robbed. He came back this time. He got, I mean, roughly it was Peña Nieto, 38%? López Obrador, 32 or something, and Josefina, 25. So, does he just not know how to concede, or what's the problem here?
Well, I mean, first we have to say that he's entitled, and what he's doing is absolutely legal. I think that's one of the things that should be stressed, because right now the Mexican people are increasingly polarized because what López Obrador did last time, which polarized a lot of people and which alienated a lot of people. So right now they're criticizing him for contesting an election, and actually that's even healthy. We can say that that's even healthy for democracy, because if he thinks, or his party thinks, that something was wrong, and they have the proofs the evidence to prove that, we all benefit from that. So that's the first thing that I should say.
You're being very nice, Ana Francisca.
Why? Well, I do think.
Yeah, I mean, it cuts both ways, and I mean, it would be interesting to thought experiment to imagine how he might have fared this time had he conceded the last time, because I think his behavior the last time probably put off a lot of people and maybe led to Peña Nieto's win. I don't know, or maybe if the current mayor Marcelo Ebrard, who seems like a more moderate personality, had run. I mean, it just seems like Mexico has not been able to develop a more modern democratic left the way Brazil, Chile have, and that seems to be an ongoing problem. And I frankly, it seems like he's just a big part of the problem, because he's a very demagogic character who makes it all about himself. And even the way the party selected him to be the nominee was not transparent or democratic.
I agree absolutely with you, but I think that there's one fundamental difference from what happened before, which is I don't think that the rest of his party is gonna put up with him, declaring himself legitimate president again. First, because they won this. I mean, they won the second place in the contest, and that's huge for them. That had never happened before. They won Mexico City with more than 60% of the votes. They won most of the sections of Mexico City, which is it's a huge triumph. They won the state of Morelos, which also was not from, they had these very big electoral wins, and they have a very, very strong incentive to stop him if he attempts to do something even if that means breaking up with him. Right. I don't think that's, I think that's a possibility as well, because I agree with you that he doesn't represent the most progressive part of the left, as other people would represent. But in terms of the electoral conflict right now, I think the PRD is absolutely entitled, and it's legal what they're doing. Once they present their evidence, and once the Federal Tribune decides whether the evidence is enough for, whatever the response is, then we're going to see what happens. And that's going to be in the next few weeks. Today, right now, we're starting to count the district votes, which is the manual way of counting votes. So the process is it's a very long process.
Do you?
Um,
I'm sorry. I should
no,
just
no.
ask. I should ask you about. So Peña Nieto, assuming he prevails and takes office, and it is the return of the PRI. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times on Monday, the day after the election, which was pretty impressive. I guess he found out at 11 p.m. on Sunday that he won, and he said, you know, when you win the Super Bowl, usually you say, "I'm going to go to Disney World," and I guess when you win the election in Mexico, you're like, this is my chance to write an op-ed for the New York Times. So he must have gone off to some little study and dashed this off, and the New York Times held a press and he got it in. And so I read it on Monday, and he says, you know, don't worry about all the stuff you've heard about the PRI. We're not going to go back to that. I'm just 45, and I want a New Mexico too. So it's in the New York Times. I take it that means it's we can bank on it, or is there reason to be worried at all that the return of the PRI is going to take us back to 1980 or something?
Well, one thing, I think, the Mexican society is not the same as it was in 2000. So if he thinks he's going to govern the same, or the PRI thinks he's going to govern the same society, he's absolutely wrong. Right now we have, like, as citizens, we have a lot more instruments to, for example, the Transparency Act. We have a lot of,
Right.
or we have more instruments to fight back. That's one thing. And the other thing is that the PRI's record, I mean, it's not that we're inventing, that we're going to go back 7 years, but the PRI's record in the past 12 years is not good. And you said it before. I mean, they've been blocking systematically many reforms that Mexico needed, such as the political reform. They've been blocking the fiscal reform. They have blocked things that were necessary for the country, just because they didn't want to, give Felipe Calderón the satisfaction of doing something right. So their record is not that good. I mean, we see in some states, such as Coahuila, for example, that the public debt increased, in thousands and thousands and thousands of pesos, and we don't know where those monies are. There's corruption within the PRI. Very visible people that have been involved in corruption issues that are still part of the PRI, and that I think that speaks for themselves. I mean,
well,
I don't know if I'm being too negative, but
right.
It's not going to be easy.
Well, it sounds like you're going to have a busy time of it at Animal Politico in the years to come,
Hopefully.
covering this administration. And I do share your hope and frustration that I wish more people on both sides of the border thought more constructively about the region, and not just looking at Mexico as a source of problems, but also as a source of opportunities. So it's been great talking to you, and congratulations on everything that Animal Politico is, and your TV show, and hope to do this again soon sometime.
Thank you so much, Andrés.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.